Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. This week you're listening to Helen McGrath, Head of Public Affairs, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hi everyone.
And it's a very special edition indeed, because we're covering a selection of highlights from last Thursday's LLG Governance Conference at the Moller Institute at Cambridge University.
And this is LLG's first in-person conference since the pandemic.
Yes, it is. And our president, Quentin Baker, was really delighted in his welcome address to be able to come together with the membership and share good practice, provide support, and network once more. The second part of the conference is taking place on Friday, the 12th of November online, and there is still time to join that day, where we welcome the expertise of our corporate partners within this very popular conference.
Helen, you mentioned that we're selecting highlights, and I found this very difficult. Some very well-known speakers and a wide range of hot topics were covered in detail throughout the day. Well, here goes.
Top of my list has to be the first keynote speaker, Joshua Rosenberg, QC, solicitor, broadcaster, journalist, writer, and much more besides. First, Joshua addressed the controversial emerging legislation in the Judicial Review and Courts Bill concerning the reform of judicial review. These reforms were seen as a serious attack on the legal system and the rule of law. Much concern originally focused upon the limits to be imposed upon the making of quashing orders, limiting their effectiveness both as to timing and retrospective impact. Joshua remarked that in a sense, such limitations are good news for decision-making public bodies. The provisions in Part 1 of the bill provide some benefits to those bodies, as the opportunities to pursue redress under the proposed new orders will be limited. Quashing orders will be more forward-looking rather than retrospective in their effect. Nonetheless, he feels that judges will still retain a wide discretion and they can still do justice to aggrieved claimants, albeit that potential claimants may now feel that the proceedings will become less attractive as a means of seeking redress in the first instance. And as to the impact on the rule of law, Joshua's view is that judges' discretion is not too restricted by these changes. In judicial circles, the word is, they'll find a way to do justice. Let's hope so.
Let's hope indeed. I was particularly interested by his comments in relation to the divergence of laws following the EU Withdrawal Act. Joshua said he was taken by surprise by Lord Frost's announcement on the 15th of September that there is to be a major review of retained law with the objective of removing its special status. He wasn't the only one. Lord Frost, Minister of State at the Cabinet Office, announced in September two purposes to the review. The first is to remove the special status of retained EU law. Lord Frost said at the time, unless we do this, we risk giving undue precedence to laws derived from EU legislation over laws made properly by this Parliament. Second is to review comprehensively the substantive content of retained EU law. Lord Frost said that the government's intention is eventually to amend, to replace, or to repeal all that retained EU law that is not right for the UK. Lord Frost's statement suggests the size of the task at hand, and the proposals will be important to all those who give and all those who seek legal advice on the meaning of domestic law. Joshua commented that this is being seen by government as an opportunity to move further away from the influence of European jurisprudence, but he expressed real doubts about the nature of the announcement and what the government is really seeking to do. The news has caused much anxiety generally about what is ultimately intended to be achieved by the government.
If you know the stories about government intervening in failing authorities, then you will know that Max Caller is the man who the government call in to investigate. Max recounted his impressive experience undertaking best value inspections and interventions into poorly performing services. All authorities make mistakes, he says, but they need to demonstrate that they can learn from them and fix them. He said service failure is usually a symptom of poor culture and poor governance. He identified the key indicators of service failure, all drawn from his experience. He says you will find failure where the following are in evidence. 1, where the statutory officers are long-term interims and no one is taking the longer view. 2, where there is inordinate secrecy around decisions that are taken. 3, where scrutiny is ineffective or simply ignored. 4, where declarations of interests, both by councillors and officers, are not done properly. And 5, where there are usually poor record-keeping practices. Max then focused upon particular aspects of his findings at both Liverpool and Nottingham. Once again, he highlighted the absence of scrutiny, the lack of communication from the bottom to the top, the absence of effective risk evaluation, the inability to recognise governance considerations when they arise. Statutory officers lacked a clear view, and the basic right for members to ask questions was avoided. Many decisions were exempted because you could exempt them, not because it was necessary or desirable. Excessive secrecy is a red flag that something is wrong. Sunlight, he said, is the best disinfectant. How could we disagree?
Well, from one enthusiastic speaker to another, Peter Stanyan, CEO of the Association of Electoral Administrators, really blew me away for both his sheer breadth and depth of knowledge, but also his passionate delivery of the electoral process. Peter identified the key concerns: that the system is not fit for purpose, it's under immense pressure to deliver, and there are huge pressures on staff, and significantly, there are real threats to democracy itself. Peter reminded us that there are over 100 separate pieces of legislation governing electoral law dating back to the mid-19th century, in what's become a highly complex framework of disconnected rules which are increasingly difficult to understand. Peter highlighted the AEA's blueprint for a modern electoral landscape, bringing resilience and capacity to UK democracy. This report calls on each UK government to take decisive action to bring capacity and resilience to this fundamental, no-fail public service. In a comprehensive review of each stage of his current electoral process, their blueprint for electoral reform includes calls for a single Electoral Administration Act to modernise core processes while reflecting the divergent approach for all 4 UK nations, an extended 30-day electoral timetable, earlier deadlines for absent voting applications to meet voters' needs, absent voting arrangements fit for the 21st century, a full review of electoral funding to reduce the burden on local authorities, and a re-evaluation of the electoral registration process to reduce bureaucracy, including reviewing the effectiveness of the annual canvass and exploring automatic and compulsory registration. Peter also highlighted that electoral reform is high on the Senedd agenda in Wales.
Bob Pritchard is a popular speaker at LLG conferences. He made a number of insightful observations about planning and its relationship to the levelling up agenda. He began by saying that we all want to know what levelling up means to us in local government, but actually we do not yet know. However, there are clear indications that levelling up is intended to be an iteration of a number of initiatives aimed at rebalancing the economy. He says planning is a key tool in that process. The Centre for Cities definition of levelling up is that it is primarily involved in the objective of narrowing divergence in health, education, and public service provision. Planning has a vital role to play, Bob argues, in the development of the concept of levelling up so that places meet their full potential, especially outside London. He recognises that the Levelling Up initiative is being well funded, but the question remains as to what the priorities for local areas are and how can planning as a tool help that process. Bob says that if planning processes work properly, then it is a good tool to direct where local investment ought to go and how it should be spent on the projects that will make a real difference. Planning can help identify what good growth in local areas might look like. Levelling up involves opportunities for devolution and the devolving of powers to a local and more appropriate level. There needs to be a careful examination of how planning powers are devolved locally in order to make that real difference. Bob says that one of the key threats to successful levelling up is the continued expansion of permitted development rights, which government is deploying in order to promote more housing. This does not necessarily constitute good growth itself, nor does it contribute to good growth locally.
Are we living in a post-Nolan age, an environment in which there are few examples of good standards and ethical behaviour? That was the question posed by Bethan Evans during the session on the future landscape of local government. It was during the conference that the news broke about Owen Paterson MP and the government's reported U-turn. The fallout from that was continuing over the weekend, and there's plenty of commentary in the press from a variety of sources. Lord Evans, chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, in a speech to the IFG last week and referring to the vote, stated, "In my view, the vote on the report by the Common Standard Committee was a very serious and damaging moment for Parliament and for the public standards in this country." Bethan noted in her address that in practice, speaking truth to power does not always just arise in relation to big decisions. It is the micro-truths where it matters. Get these right, and the big decisions will follow. It's worth noting again that we are still waiting on the response to the Committee on Standards in Public Life's ethical review, which was published back in 2019 and which proposes significant recommendations to improve both governance and standards. Now you can get much more on this and all the conference items mentioned in this week's podcast by going to Bulletin 43, available this Friday on the LLG website. And don't forget that day 2 of the conference is online and takes place on Friday, the 12th of November. And with that, it's goodbye from me.
And from me too.
Thank you for listening. Have a good week.